2019 series of City Talks on the theme of politics and the city. My name is Deniz Ünsal, and I'm a sessional at the Anthropology Department and also a member of the UBIC Committee for Urban Studies, which runs City Talks. I'd like to begin by first acknowledging that this event is taking place on the traditional territories of the Lekwangan-speaking peoples, as well as acknowledge the Songhees, Espanol, and Wistanech peoples whose historical relationship with the land continue to this day. I also would like to acknowledge the financial support of the Faculty of Social Sciences, as well as the Departments of Geography, History, Political Science, and Environmental Studies, and the Gustafsson School of Business, which have supported the City Talks this year. And this year marks the 10th anniversary of the City Talks lecture series. And if you're interested in supporting the series as a donor or co-sponsor, we encourage you to visit our website at thecitytalks.ca for more information. I am very happy to welcome Arbella Bet-Shlimon, Associate Professor of History at the University of Washington. In her research and teaching, she focuses on 20th century Iraq and Persian Gulf region, as well as Middle Eastern urban history. Dr. Bet-Shlimon is the author of City of Black Gold, Oil, Ethnicity, and the Making of Modern Kirkuk, which was published by Stanford University in 2019. And we're very happy to have her here, and we're looking forward to your talk. Arbella, please.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming tonight. It's a delight to be in Victoria. I'm a Seattle native and haven't been here for about 20 years, so it's wonderful to come and give a talk here. So thank you for inviting me and thank you for coming. So my talk today is, as Deniz said, it's about Kirkuk, which is a city in northern Iraq. And the title that you see for this talk, which I've projected here, Ethnicity and Conflict in Iraq's Oil City, it's just my attempt to situate the talk so that someone who sees this on a poster knows what they're getting into when they come in. Okay, ethnicity, conflict, oil, Iraq, right? It's basically pure marketing. I'm just throwing all the buzzwords into the title. But I actually prefer not to start this talk by thinking of Kirkuk as an Iraqi city. So I start this presentation and also my book, one of the first map that appears in the book, City of Black Gold.
Oh, that's
oh, better? Can you hear me? So the first map that appears in my book, City of Black Gold, is what you see on the left here. This is a map of Kirkuk in its environment without international boundaries. So you can see where it fits in to other surrounding cities and bodies of water. Earlier today, I came here from Seattle on the Victoria River, and I crossed an international boundary to do that, but I also moved within the lands and waters of the Coast Salish people, as Deniz acknowledged at the beginning of the talk, and I remain on that territory. So I think that when you remove the colonial boundaries, you can look at a place differently, and that's how I prefer to start looking at Kirkuk. So this place, Kirkuk, is Iraq's 4th to 6th largest city, depending on what estimate you look at. Population is less than 1 million, so it's provincial. And on the ground, it's not especially remarkable looking. And yet, it's the subject of an impassioned territorial dispute that millions of people have very strong opinions about. Virtually every Iraqi has a very strong opinion about this dispute. Most every Kurdish person who is politically aware has an opinion. Much of the population of Turkey has an opinion on this topic, and many, many other people. And it's a city in crisis. It's politically stagnant and ethnically segregated. For decades, its residents have had to contend with a constant war of words and episodic violence over the city's status. After a US-led military operation overthrew the Iraqi Baath regime in 2003, the disputes over Kirkuk's future held up all sorts of parliamentary discussions and even delayed national elections. And Iraqi lawmakers and foreign policymakers have spent the years since then attempting to address the urgent need to resolve rival claims to control Kirkuk and rival claims to the city's identity. I'll get into the dimensions of that dispute in a moment, so who's doing the disputing. But first, let's touch on the reasons for the dispute. So why does this mid-sized city in Iraq matter to so many people? Most commentators would offer a simple answer to this question, and that is oil. After all, the city rests on top of a supergiant oil field. Kirkuk was the first place oil was discovered in Iraq, and for decades it was the heart of the country's oil industry prior to the discovery and development of larger fields in southern Iraq that today are the dominant fields. But this was the center of the oil industry for many years. And its oil made the city and its hinterland a strategically crucial region for Baghdad, which went to great lengths to integrate this majority non-Arab city into mostly Arab Iraq, sometimes quietly and sometimes brutally. You'd be hard-pressed to find a discussion of Kirkuk's political crisis since 2003 that does not contain the modifier oil-rich to describe the city. If anyone in here has read an article about Kirkuk in the past 15 years, you have almost certainly seen it described as the oil-rich city of Kirkuk in either the headline or the first line of that article. This is how we talk about it. But the idea of oil as a cause of Kirkuk's ethnic conflict is seldom explored in any greater detail. One of the central questions of my work is, what does it mean, really, for a dispute to be about oil? Kirkuk's conflict is not only about oil in the simplistic sense that Kirkukis have no stakes in other forms of control and legitimacy. So we often use the notion that a dispute is about a resource to suggest that it's not about other things that are more pure and genuine. So for example, America didn't invade Iraq to get a democracy, they invaded it for the oil. We've probably heard a formulation like this before. But claims to Kirkuk's history and culture are a powerful factor in the dispute that cannot be dismissed as a flimsy pretense fabricated post hoc to justify a desire to control oil. In other words, the dispute over Kirkuk is also a competition for historical memory. Kirkuk is one of the most multilingual cities of its size in the Middle East, in that there are 3 very widely spoken languages plus other minority languages, and no clear majority native language. So signs like the one that you see on this slide, which has 5 languages on it, signs with 3 or 4 or even 5 languages, are part of the landscape of this place. They're very common. So its culture is diverse and syncretic. People are used to seeing this kind of thing all the time. But communities within the city and outside of it have their own narratives of its history, and it's significant that they tell these narratives in strongly ethnic ways. That is, a person's ethnic identity is a strong predictive factor of how they characterize Kirkuk. So Kurds tend to claim that Kirkuk has always been a Kurdish city, and that they have been fighting to restore Kirkuk to its rightful status as a Kurdish city for an undefined but presumably very long period of time. Many prominent Kurds have referred to Kirkuk as the Kurdish Jerusalem. Turkmens, who are native speakers of a Turkish dialect prevalent in northern Iraq, they usually claim that Kirkuk is rightfully a Turkmen city, and that its Turkmen character has been altered by force since the end of the Ottoman Empire. Now, when I talk about Iraqi Turkmens, I want to clarify, because I often get this question, that they are not the same people as the Turkmens of Turkmenistan. So we're not talking about an expat community from another country here. It's a group that's native to northern Iraq, and they speak a dialect of Turkish. So the Turkmens see themselves as marginalized within their own city, and they claim that they face, in their words, a genocide. Then there are also members of less numerous ethnic groups. These are mostly Arabs who predominate in the rest of Iraq, but there are also Assyrians and other minorities. And these groups typically stress the view that Kirkuk has always been a microcosm of Iraq's diversity, and therefore it is rightfully an Iraqi city, where the term Iraqi here is imagined to encompass something that's pluralistic and not sectarian. The prevailing understanding of Kirkuk, despite being in some senses all about this kind of history, is actually very ahistorical, because it tends to assume these ethnic groups have always been there and always had the same interests. But ethnolinguistic identity, that is an identity that's based on a language that your group speaks, so Kurdish, Turkish, Arabic, etc., this is a process and a phenomenon that is in flux. For example, ethnicity can go from an insignificant background fact about a population to the dividing line in an altercation very suddenly. And this is true everywhere, not just in Kirkuk. Ethnicity is a concept that people in the region themselves use today to refer to Kirkuk's communities, which is why I am using the term. And I clarify this because some scholars who write about places like this avoid the use of the word ethnic altogether because they see it as a problematic construction. But I'm using it because Kirkukis themselves use it in English as a translation for various words for communal identity in their native languages. And they even have neologisms adapted from the English word ethnic that they use in their native languages. But it's a concept that developed in the 20th century. It's clear that what we might more generally call communal social linguistic identities, like Arab and Kurdish and Turkmen, these have existed for a long time, for hundreds of years at least. But they were not constant in definition, nor were they sites of political mobilization or the cleavage lines in a territorial dispute until relatively recently. So Kirkuk is a disputed city with a diverse population, and there are many others in the world like it. A historical view of how identities become politicized in a place like this, it gives us a fuller understanding of how local politics can become organized around these sorts of claims. And ethnicity is not only a concern of political and intellectual history. In urban history, economic, societal, and intellectual trends are tightly bound together. So how did ethnic identities in Kirkuk develop into this institutionalized Kurdish, Turkmen, Arab schema that's so familiar today? And how did those ethnicities become politically salient? That question brings us back to oil. I argue that in 20th century Kirkuk, oil, urbanization, and colonialism guided the processes of nation building and collective identity formation. The city that these forces built gave rise to fragmented, contentious local politics. Ethnicity as a concept developed and hardened because the oil industry, along with Baghdad's nation-building policies and the British colonial presence, interacted with local economic and social fault lines. As Kirkuk grew, its inhabitants became more invested in its urban political domain, and they tended to do so along ethnicized lines. That is, their interests increasingly became determined by whether they belonged to this or that linguistic group. Before urbanization and before the discovery of oil, these communal identities hadn't mattered as much. So the Iraqi state was established as a League of Nations mandate under British control in 1920, with Kirkuk provisionally part of its de facto territory. And back then, local politics were largely subsumed under relations between more powerful external entities. At the time, Kirkuk was a mostly Turkish-speaking city in a region surrounded mostly by Arabic speakers to the southwest and Kurdish speakers to the northeast. After the end of World War I, in which Allied forces had defeated the Ottoman Empire, which controlled Kirkuk up to that point, this city, Kirkuk and Mosul, which you see on this map, and the mostly Kurdish areas to their northeast, were disputed between British Iraq and the newly formed Republic of Turkey. And the whole region that you see here from this League of Nations map was under British military control, at least nominally. The further northeast you went, that was a little more tenuous, but Kirkuk was definitely under British administration. And this dispute between Iraq and Turkey dragged on for years before the League of Nations resolved it by granting the territory to Iraq and negotiating a treaty in 1926 between Iraq, Turkey, and Britain. And throughout that period of international conflict, the political interests of the people of Kirkuk were primarily determined not by ethnicity or any kind of proto-ethnicity, but by their patronage networks. The major patrons here were the British administrators of Mandate Iraq, the semi-colonial entity, the fledgling Iraqi central government, and the Republic of Turkey. So Kirkukis chose sides based on which entity best served their interests, or they positioned themselves against a side based on its hostility or perceived hostility to their concerns. Their stances sometimes aligned in predictable ways with self-identity. So for instance, many of Kirkuk's Turkish-speaking elites had close ties in Turkey, they had family members in Turkey, and they wanted to be part of the Turkish Republic. But this was very inconsistent and unpredictable. And this was something that the European League of Nations mediators found confusing and vexing. They traveled to this region to resolve the dispute with this map, And they wanted to find ethnic nationalist loyalties in Kirkuk to help them resolve it, and they openly expressed frustration that they couldn't. So the formal granting of Kirkuk to Iraq paved the way for an oil concession, spearheaded by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company that had been prospecting and extracting oil in neighboring Iran for a couple of decades at that point. And that company was part of the Iraq Petroleum Company, or IPC, which is how I'll refer to it the rest of the talk. Despite having Iraq in its name, the IPC was a British registered company jointly owned by British, French, American, and Dutch interests. The IPC concession gave them a monopoly for developing Iraqi oil fields. And this was a time when oil-bearing territories were heavily dependent on experts and technologies that had been developed largely in the United States, which was the world's biggest oil producer at that point. And so these kinds of exploitative concessions benefiting Western companies were very common. So drillers struck oil just northwest of Kirkuk in 1927, and it soon became clear that the city was resting on a massive oil field, larger than anyone had anticipated. And that's when Kirkuk's profound transformation began. The IPC's presence permanently changed Kirkuk's urban fabric and demographic composition. By the 1950s, many people had migrated into the city from surrounding areas and from other parts of Iraq to work for the IPC and associated trades. Kirkuk's population multiplied nearly 5 times between the mid-1920s and 1957, and almost half of the city's inhabitants were directly or indirectly reliant on the oil company for their livelihood, so they were either its employees or their family members. Its population in the 1957 census, the map you see here on the right, was about 120,000. If you were walking around in Kirkuk at that time, the thoroughfares were now being paved with asphalt derived from local oil. And even dirt roads like the one that you see here were sprayed down with bitumen, which is an oil byproduct, to keep them from getting muddy after rainfall. So oil was literally everywhere. And the spoken languages you heard in the streets were changing. So people who spoke Turkish as their first language were now no longer a majority of the urban population. They were still a plurality at over 45,000, but there were more than 40,000 Kurdish speakers and 27,000 Arabic speakers. Now, one way that we can understand these changes is by looking at Kirkuk's ancient citadel. So the population of the citadel was stagnating and dwindling as a percentage of the city's overall population. I'll point this out here. I hope you can see that, the arrow. So this sort of darkest shaded area here is the oldest part of the city, one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world. And in recent history, it had been a center of Kirkuk's Turkish-speaking community. So this very, very old neighborhood was not growing. And then at the opposite extreme, there was a very poor Kurdish neighborhood on the outskirts of Kirkuk called Shorija. And that neighborhood more than tripled in population between 1947 and 1957. So Shorija is here on the southeast boundary of Kirkuk. Shorija's inhabitants were recent migrants from rural areas around the city, which were mostly Kurdish-speaking areas. These were people who were no longer able to make an adequate living through agriculture, and they were seeking work, which was often very dangerous manual labor with the oil company, for which they were paid a small daily wage. According to neighborhood-level urban census data, it grew far faster than any other neighborhood in Kirkuk in this era. And now another change was that, in addition to more Kurds moving in from the hinterland, the usage of Arabic was rising in the city. And this was largely because of Baghdad's ongoing effort to promote Arabic language primary and secondary education in the non-Arab areas of Iraq. The official Arabic curriculum was one of many nation-building initiatives that created a unifying national discourse in some parts of Iraq, especially Baghdad. Certainly most historians of Iraq would write about it that way, as something that was meant to unify people. But it proved to be divisive in a place like Kirkuk, where educating the mostly non-Arab students solely in Arabic was very controversial. So in the course of this project, I interviewed an Assyrian who was a child in Kirkuk in this era, and he grew up to be a linguistics professor, so he cares a lot about language. And he told me that his elementary school teachers would often just teach classes in Turkish rather than Arabic when they knew that everyone in the room knew Turkish. So they just kind of, resist the official curriculum sort of de facto without using it. So in a peripheral multilingual area, the promotion of a politics of loyalty to the nation can actually play a role in reinforcing urban social divisions rather than unifying. So Baghdad's influence and growing political consciousness and growing tensions in Kirkuk combined in a labor strike in the oil company in 1946. And the aftermath of that strike would shape the city's political and economic trajectory for over a decade. Now, this story is intertwined with that of the rise of the Iraqi Communist Party as Iraq's most popular opposition political force. The Iraqi Communist Party was a local movement with some regional ties, especially to the Communist Party in Iran, and its base came partly from Iraq's heavy industries, of which oil was the largest. And I emphasize here that this was a local movement with regional ties because looking at the time period, 1946, looking at a third world communist movement, you might think, oh, this is the Russians came in, right? It's a Soviet thing. And it would be a mistake to see this as an arm of the Soviets. Certainly there was a shared network of ideas, but this really was a local and regional movement. So the Iraqi Communist Party, based in Baghdad, sent operatives to Kirkuk to seek work with the oil company and promote their ideas among the workers. And the communists did this. They distributed a pamphlet among their fellow oil workers, and they attempted to create a union. And they didn't quite do that, but they managed to form a committee that made demands of the company, including a demand for employee housing. When negotiations with the company failed, the organized workers called for a strike of the IBC's Iraqi workforce, and it worked. It was a huge strike. And though the strike was a communist project, it was undergirded by long-standing grievances of daily wage workers about their poor working conditions that weren't necessarily ideological. The British company was also very unpopular among locals, and the expats' complete segregation from the life of the city didn't help with their reputation, and that also strengthened the motivations for the strike. The strike continued for a couple of weeks while the company refused to budge, and it then came to a disastrous end when Kirkuk's police fired on the protesters and killed several of them on the order of the provincial governor, but also British officials. So this strike and its terrible end alarmed the Iraqi and British establishments. They knew that Kirkukis were turning against them. So it was a watershed moment that prompted the British government, the Iraqi government, and the IPC to pursue urban development projects to preserve their political position in the city. Though this time period was well after the British mandate, that League of Nations mandate, was over, it had ended in 1932, but the UK Foreign Office continued to hold some influence in Kirkuk directly through a local consulate and indirectly through the IPC, which was a private company but essentially semi-colonial in its structure with very close British government ties. The development projects included building of urban infrastructure, like modern water and electricity systems. The IPC had the technology and capital to lead these projects. Conveniently, this also allowed the company to leverage its power with the municipal and provincial governments. And I mean that quite literally. The oil company had a certain amount of physical control over Kirkuk's municipal electricity, as well as its water, because they built those systems. The IPC also expanded Kirkuk's urban fabric through housing schemes for its employees. Later, Iraqi government housing schemes were modeled after the IPC ones. The private company ones actually came first. And the areas of construction were part of a trend of urban expansion toward the northwest, where the oil fields were. So if on this map of Kirkuk in the 50s, you can see sort of the railway here, the areas northwest of that are labeled as Auto5 and Mosul. These are mainly where these houses were being built. So the largest of these employee housing schemes was the Auto5 Estate in the northwestern part of the city. This was a housing estate for oil company workers, and this is what it looked like from the ground. And I particularly like, these are two different photos. One comes from the National Archive of the UK, the other from the archive of the urban planner who worked with the Iraqi government in Kirkuk, Konstantinos Doxiadis. But you notice what they have in common is that when the man with the tripod shows up and sets up his camera, the kids come out to see what he's doing. And so you see children in these kinds of photographs, which is a great little sort of bonus archival material history. So this is what the Auto5 Estate looked like from the ground, and its residents were mostly Assyrians, Aramaic-speaking Christians who were close to the company. Now, by the way, it sounds in this talk like I am using the terms Assyrian and Christian interchangeably, even though they really are not interchangeable terms, and this is something I'd be happy to get into after the talk. The nuances of identity of the smaller groups outside of the three largest groups are something I've cut for time from my main remarks, but I'm very happy to get into that. So this estate near the company headquarters was mostly Assyrian, and Muslim employees of the company tended not to want to live near the oil company, even when they were offered houses there with subsidized rent. So the Auto5 Estate is just one example of how urban segregation between communities was widespread by the 1950s. The exact nature and extent of Kirkuk's segregation can be difficult to pin down, and this makes it a lot different from a lot of other oil cities and company towns of this era where racial or ethnic or class segregation was very overt and intentional. So neighborhoods would actually be built for this and that group. And you don't see that in Kirkuk in the same way. It wasn't always as obvious there, but the presence of these kinds of physical divisions was there, and it would prove to be salient before too long after the 1958 Iraqi Revolution, which I'll get to in a moment. But for now, what I'll talk about is how, as the city became more segregated, popular discourse promoted a civic identity for Kirkuk. Development projects were bolstered with prominent celebrations of Kirkuk's newfound oil modernity. And Kirkuk came to be known in these texts and films as Iraq's oil city, or more evocatively, the city of black gold. These discourses coincided with a rise in literacy and an expansion of Kirkuk's literary culture, including the building of both public and private libraries and bookstores. Books about Kirkuk started to appear from Iraqi presses in the 1940s and 1950s, and these books discussed Kirkuk as a discrete arena of history, economy, and culture. They created taxonomies of Kirkukis, dividing them by ethnicity and by tribe. So this is the point where we can see that these concepts have entered popular discourse. We increasingly start to see the use of words meaning nationality or race or people to describe Kirkuk's linguistic communities. If anyone knows Arabic, in Arabic the words we're seeing are things like qawmiya and unsur and ahd, which means nationality, race, and people. In Turkish, you often see millet, which is a word that had a much different meaning in the Ottoman era, referring to confessional communities, and here it's used sort of to mean ethnic groups. There's other words as well. All of these words would eventually be translated into English as ethnicity, which is an increasingly solidifying concept at this time, in English as well as in these languages. So these discourses also emphasized the transformative power of oil. For instance, these images that you see here are an excerpt of one of these books about Kirkuk that starts to come out. This one was published in 1957. And on the right, the photo shows a man standing in front of his new house built under an IPC housing scheme. And the caption, the original caption of this photo in Arabic is not included on the slide, but the caption says that he is looking at his future with confidence and peace of mind after building a modern nest for his children. So the IPC and British diplomats were completely explicit about the fact that they viewed this scheme and others like it as a way of combating communist influence. One British official said that promoting property ownership among the oil company's workforce would turn them into, in his exact words, small-scale capitalists. So by the late 1950s, Kirkuk had a clear identity as the city of black gold and a distinct domain of local politics. In the aftermath of Iraq's 1958 revolution, this political domain became an arena in which the city's communities competed for authority. On July 14, 1958, a bloody army coup in Baghdad overthrew the monarchy and killed the most powerful figures in the old Iraqi establishment. And by upending the establishment, the coup dramatically diminished British influence. After 1958, the polarized and unstable politics of the revolution interacted with volatile local dynamics in Kirkuk in deadly ways, pitting the city's ethnic communities against one another in a way yet unknown in its modern history. Remember that non-sectarian communism had managed to briefly take hold among Kirkuki workers in the 1940s. That was the dominant political force at that time. This overshadowed other political trends that revolved around ethnic identities. But those sorts of ideologies had since become subsumed under the rubrics of ethnic nationalisms in Kirkuk. Namely, Turkmens were historically the city's elites, while Kurds were more likely to be poorer recent migrants from the countryside who organized under the Communist Party. Also, the Kurdish national movement began to claim Kirkuk as part of Kurdish territory for the first time around 1958, and they did this while aligned with the communists. The Iraqi Communist Party was the most popular party in Kirkuk immediately after the revolution. It had a moment in 1958 and 1959. And its ascent contributed to a sense among Kirkuki Turkmens that they were being sidelined within their own city. So a vicious conflict between increasingly unitary Kurdish and Turkmen communities emerged, bolstered by these differing class and political affiliations. In the revolutionary era, these communities, along with the Baghdad-based Iraqi state, publicly staked their claims to the city of Kirkuk, its history, and its oil. They did so both verbally and violently, demonstrating the fruition of a distinct but divisive urban arena in which there was little room for negotiation. The organization of politics along the lines of left versus right and poor versus elite in revolutionary Iraq in revolutionary Iraq, therefore dramatically intensified the ethno-political mobilization in urban Kirkuk that had already been evident in a much briefer form for decades. The single worst episode of intercommunal violence in revolutionary Kirkuk occurred in July 1959, on the first anniversary of the coup. And it fueled a cycle of attacks and counterattacks that continued well into the 1960s. For months after the July 1958 coup, the Turkmen and Kurdish communities had performed power publicly in the city by staging demonstrations and erecting decorative arches with their slogans throughout the city, thus staking their claims to urban spaces. Those slogans notably claimed to be inclusive of all Kirkukis and loyal to the new government in Baghdad. So in other words, they were not things like Kirkuk is a Kurdish city. They actually claimed to unite everybody. But depending on who was sponsoring and displaying them, they were commonly interpreted as a show of power by that particular group. So the terrible events of July 14th, 1959 began when Kurdish affiliates of the Communist Party decided to demonstrate in the center of Kirkuk as a defiant show of their strength in the city. Turkmens planned their own demonstration for the same day in response. And on that day, the two processions went ahead as planned and passed by each other in the historic core of the city near the citadel, at first uneventfully. Then something caused the Kurdish demonstrators to attack a Turkmen-owned coffee shop, which you see named here as the 14th of July Cafe, and they destroyed it and killed the owner. A fight between the demonstrators followed, and the Turkmens, who were not carrying firearms, were overwhelmed by the armed Kurds. The Kurdish demonstrators were then joined by Kurdish troops from an army division stationed locally. They attacked houses in the citadel and destroyed many more buildings. These attacks continued for 2 days until government reinforcements restored order. In the end, at least 31 people had been killed and 130 injured, and the overwhelming majority of casualties were Turkmens. 24 out of 28 of the perpetrators of the attacks who were eventually convicted were Kurds. A public statement by a group of prominent Turkmens in the immediate aftermath of the attack characterized it as, in their words, a genocidal war against the Turkmen race. The attacks of July 1959 in Kirkuk were eruptions of ethnic rivalry in the city's historic residential and commercial centers that threw into relief the ways in which group identities had solidified. In this case, the racialized language used by Turkmens describing the event is significant, especially when considered with the stark ethnic differences between the perpetrators and the victims. Namely, the strongest forces in Kirkuk's politics had shifted into discrete and mutually hostile ethnic categories. The new forces prioritized control over the city of Kirkuk itself, politically, historically, and symbolically, as a crucial political domain. More so than at any point in any prior time in Iraq's modern history, Kirkuk's interests after 1958 came to depend on whether they were Kurdish, Turkmen, Arab, or Christian, or could be perceived as belonging to one of those groups. The revolutionary era also brought to power governments in Iraq that were increasingly authoritarian. Baghdad's previously subtle efforts to promote Arab dominance in Kirkuk through things like the official curriculum turned into outright ethnic cleansing in the 1960s. The Kurdish community, which was linked with a rebel movement, bore the brunt of it. In 1963, the Iraqi government used the oil industry's technology to carry this out, seizing the IPC's heavy equipment and using it to destroy several Kurdish villages on the outskirts of the city. The men from the villages were deported to southern Iraq, while women and children were left homeless and traumatized, reduced to begging at the oil company camp. In 1968, a coup led by the Iraqi Baath Party brought a new regime to power, where it remained until the US-led coalition invasion in 2003. When the Baath Party seized power, Kirkukis responded to the new government's authoritarianism in a number of ways. The party was radically Arab nationalist, but it had affiliates of every ethnicity and religious sect. And its initial willingness to negotiate with Kurdish and Turkmen activists initially led to cautious cooperation. But over time, the party extended tight, multi-layered control over all of Kirkuk's institutions and spaces, ultimately leaving Kirkukis with few tenable choices beyond collaboration, dangerous resistance, or exile. Anyone who did not conform to the Baathist agenda was attacked. Baath-era discourse referred to ethnic groups as qawmiyas, or nationalities in Arabic, continuing a recent trend in Kirkuk. The logic of dividing Iraqis in general and Kirkukis in particular into qawmiyas for the purpose of governance relied on the assumption that one's qawmiya, one's nationality or ethnicity, determined one's loyalty to the state. So all people who were not Arab were persecuted under this logic, but Kurds suffered the highest costs. The idea of qawmiya as a primary form of identity was at the ideological roots of the Baath Party. The party had, from its beginnings, when it was founded in Syria, professed a form of nationalism dependent on solidarities across a shared linguistic communal identity of being Arab. The Iraqi Baath extended this idea by employing the governance logic of qawmiya in a confrontational way. The initial project of nationalizing Kirkuk in order to integrate it into the state eventually gave way to a more explicit logic of ethnic cleansing or Arabization. You actually see a shift in the terminology used by the Iraqi Baath from nationalizing Kirkuk to Arabizing. They eventually sort of take away the smokescreen and make it very clear what they're doing. In Kirkuk, with its segregation and its mutual mistrust among ethnic groups, this method of control produced the deadliest crimes of the Iraqi Baath regime. It was under the Baath that Iraq nationalized its oil industry in 1972, which eliminated the last vestiges of colonial-era influence in Kirkuk and consolidated Baghdad's presence by bringing a large percentage of the city's workforce onto the government payroll, not to mention bringing all that heavy equipment directly under government control. The government created a union of the oil workers that it controlled, and it subjected employees for even the smallest, most menial jobs in the company to surveillance to ensure their loyalty to the Baath Party. Job applications for mundane tasks, even things like driving, had to pass through a security directorate that would deny a worker access to the oil installations if there was any hint that they were not Baathists. Meanwhile, the oil company was a major symbolic target for the growing Kurdish resistance to the Baath Party. Kurdish rebels attacked Kirkuk's oil installations more than once in the 1970s and 1980s. Saddam Hussein, who became the president of Iraq in 1979, was explicit about the fact that he saw the integration of Kirkuk into Iraq as crucial to Iraqi unity. As part of the Arabization campaign, the Baath adopted a policy of expelling non-Arabs from Kirkuk, including Kurds, Turkmens, and Assyrians, and replacing them with Arab settlers from southern Iraq for whom they built new neighborhoods. They gerrymandered the borders of the province to exclude Kurdish areas in the northeast and incorporate Arab ones in the southwest. So this is where, looking at the map of how Kirkuk had changed by 2003, becomes instructive. The historic core of the city, this is the citadel, where my pointer is right now. So that is now in the northern third of the city, and the city, which had previously been expanding toward the northwest, toward the oil fields, is now expanding enormously toward the southwest and no longer toward the north. And so it's expanding in the direction of an Arabic-speaking hinterland, but also literally in the direction of Baghdad. It's as though Baghdad is exerting a gravitational pull on the city, and these are the new neighborhoods that are being built for settlers from Iraq's south. In 1986, Baath government began a genocidal campaign against the Kurds that they called Al-Anfal. The campaign also targeted other non-Arab minority groups living in northeastern Iraq. And the most infamous episode in this campaign that some of you may have heard of was the deadly chemical attack on the village of Halabja in 1988, which killed thousands of people. It's especially infamous to Americans familiar with that era's geopolitics who know that the US government was openly supporting Saddam Hussein at that time. But what is often overlooked is that the Northern Bureau of the Baath Party was stationed in Kirkuk during this genocide. In other words, the infamous Ali Hassan al-Majid, who's sometimes been called Chemical Ali for planning the gas attacks, he planned those attacks from an office in Kirkuk. One of the major camps that held prisoners during this genocide was also located on the outskirts of Kirkuk. After the end of Al-Anfal, Saddam Hussein's government also targeted Kirkuk's historic citadel, which had previously, as I said, been one of the oldest continuously inhabited places in the world. They expelled its mostly Turkish-speaking residents and razed many of the homes in the citadel. In other words, the city became the center of Baghdad's final attempt to violently homogenize and incorporate the multilingual, multicultural northeastern region. It should therefore be no surprise that it has also become the center of Kurdish and Turkmen nationalist imaginaries. I'll conclude here with a few remarks on Kirkuk's present situation. So in the wake of the 2003 US-led coalition invasion of Iraq, the dispute over Kirkuk has been, in practical terms, between the Kurdistan Regional Government in Iraq's northeast, which has been an autonomous Kurdish region since 1991, and the central government in Baghdad. Most Kurds think that Kirkuk should be part of Kurdistan, and most others who are not Kurdish dread the idea of Kurdish control and think that Kirkuk should remain aligned with Baghdad. The city has traded control between Kurdistan and Baghdad a few times in the past 16 years. So it was first seized from Saddam Hussein's forces by Kurdish troops fighting with the coalition in 2003. Those troops then withdrew after 6 months, but they stayed on the outskirts of the city. And then in June 2014, when the organization known as Islamic State, or ISIS, took over nearby Mosul, Kurdish troops moved back in and controlled Kirkuk for over 3 years. In October 2017, in fact 2 years ago yesterday, Iraqi troops took it back in an overnight offensive. That's basically where things stand right now. So Kirkuk hasn't experienced the same level of intercommunal violence since 2003 as Iraq's largest cities, places like Baghdad and Basra and Mosul. But its situation is extremely tense for those who live there, and it will continue to be as long as the status isn't resolved. One of the common features of Kirkuk's political stagnation is the contention that this group's interest is the one that is really inclusive, while that other group is the chauvinistic one. So, for example, while Kirkuk was under Kurdish control between 2014 and 2017, Kirkuk's Kurdish governor argued that the Kurdish flag represented all Kirkukis. And as you can see on this slide on the left, at the height of this hubris in early 2017, the provincial council voted to raise Kurdish flags all over over all of Kirkuk's government buildings on the pretense that the Kurdish flag united all of the residents of Kirkuk. And you see this Kurdish-dominated provincial council holding up the Kurdish flag and kind of taking selfies in front of it, right? So this is the peak of that reasoning. And then in October 2017, again, 2 years ago yesterday, when Iraqi troops took Kirkuk back, images circulated on Twitter and other forms of social media of people triumphantly taking down the Kurdish flags. I saw videos of people, taking them down the flagpoles, and replacing them with Iraqi flags. Or what you see in the photo on the right here that I got from Twitter is some people unfurling a massive Iraqi flag in the streets, as though to say, no, this is the flag that represents all Kirkukis. Never mind the genocide perpetrated by that very state, this is the flag that represents everybody. So the implication of this back and forth is that we want Kirkuk for legitimate reasons that are good for everybody, and you just want it for the oil, for yourselves. And what I'm saying is that acknowledging Kirkuk's painful history of ethnic fault lines and their relationship with oil is a vital initial step toward reconciliation. Good faith efforts at concession of interests, withdrawal of blame, and recognition of each other's needs and grievances are required of everyone who has a stake in the Kirkuk crisis during the process of negotiation. One can only hope that a frank reckoning with this history, and specifically with the legacy of oil in Kirkuk, might play a role in the city's future. Thank you.